Erik Penser Banks hälsovårdsdag. Vi ska gå vidare med Initiator Pharma och för att presentera bolaget har vi vd Klaus Ellsborg Olesen på länk som kommer genomföra presentation på engelska. Very welcome Klaus and go ahead with your presentation.
For be able to join you in Stockholm on this day, but we are a small company and all hands are needed on deck when we are working out operations here in Denmark. So the usual disclaimer for the presentation. Initiator Pharma is a clinical stage pharma company dedicated to developing innovative drugs that target critical unmet medical needs within the central and the peripheral nervous system. And of course, this is quite a broad selection of indications. But when we're coming back to the modalities and the way we're targeting these, you can see there's a little bit more contingency in what we're actually doing here. So Initiator Pharma is a company. We are a Danish company headquartered in Copenhagen. We are listed on the First North Stock Exchange in Stockholm and traded under the ticker name of INIT. And the current financing of the company will take us into 2025. We have about 4,000 shareholders. And to date, we have raised about 200 million Swedish crowns, taking everything that we have started with back in 2016, all the way up to where we are today, delivering significant clinical results in phase 2A's and 2B trials. Our shareholder base, besides the 4,000, you can say retail investors that invested us, also consists of two cornerstone investors with life science expertise and insight. Adrigo and also Link are sitting on good portions of the shares in the company. Besides that, also the management is a big shareholder combined in the company and are very much incentivized to keep the company going as a company that actually is very cost efficient and delivering results for the benefit of shareholders, and that including us as well. So what is it actually we do when we start selecting the assets going into the company? And we often talk about the clinical programs and we're running this, and this, but I would actually like to spend just a few minutes on explaining what we actually do when we're looking at assets. We want to do something that we know that the drug target is validated. So it's a target that we know that can be targeted with the modality we're pursuing. Preferably, we have some kind of assets that actually target these targets with demonstrated the safety and tolerability, preferably from a clinical trial, but also from very, very clean preclinical experiments will suffice for selecting such a compound going forward. We want to have enough preclinical and clinical data supporting the MOA, so the method of action, so meaning that what we actually targeting, the result of our asset, our drug molecule is actually something that can be translated from the in vivo models into efficacy in patients in the selected indications. Some indications there's really good validated models for taking them going directly from the animals into the humans, and others, you need to look at other indicators suggesting that the translatability will be high. This is really important for us because this is also a really important part for lowering the risk of selecting assets going into the clinic with. One of the things, of course, that we always have to look at when you're developing a new drug is there an unmet medical need? And there needs to be an unmet medical need within a commercial attractive position. Otherwise, you develop into something that is not going to sell and that's not going to have any commercial value. Also, you can say with these things that we have mentioned now, saying that we are de-risking, but we need to create the value. And how do we do that? We do that by demonstrating that actually these new drug assets actually provide belief or provide efficacy in a clinical setting. We want to run fairly modest timeline. You can say short timelines experiments where you don't waiting for data over many years. We also want to have clinical trials where we don't need to spend too much money coming to these clinical proof of concept data points. All this combined that I've shown you here is actually a cornerstone in how we develop our compounds, take them in early, validating them, making sure we understand how they work and what they can be used for, and then actually generating the clinical proof of concept in a, you can say, as solid setting as possible to get the most de-risking out of the project at this stage. So we are committed to deliver within these four cornerstones we have set here, and we are thinking of return of investment in everything we do, as I said before. So based on these criteria, we actually selected off a number of compounds we have in our clinical pipeline. And this is actually, as we talked about, but it's a complementary pipeline that actually we are targeting indications that are similar or has some of the same backgrounds. The two compounds that I'm going to talk mostly about today is pudafensine, previously known as IP 2015, and that's actually, like all the others, it's a monoamine reuptake inhibitor, and I'll come back to that in the next couple of slides. It is developed for organic erectile dysfunction, and we completed the enrollment of our phase 2b study, and we are expecting the results here in Q4, but I'll get back to that. In parallel to the development in organic ED, we have developed this in neuropathic pain, and we have some time ago demonstrated in a clinical healthy volunteer pain study, challenge studies, shown that we actually have really good efficacy on pain that resembles neuropathic pain from both allodynia and also hyperalgesia. So this is an exciting project that we are continuing to evaluate how to position best, but of course also waiting for the data of the phase 2b to see how we progress this best forward. Most recently, we presented new data on the IP 2018 trial. This is for what we call psychogenic erectile dysfunction. So this is patients that are having, mild depressed or low mood, and also have erectile dysfunction at the same time. And we have reported positive phase 2a data, and I'll also show. Besides that, we have some earlier stage clinical assets that we are still working on and will not be discussed today. So why is the modulation of monoamine of relevance, not only for us, but also for patients? So we know that the monoaminic system consists of a network of neurons in the brain that uses monoamines as neurotransmitters to regulate processes such as emotion, arousal, mood, sexual function, memory, also motor functions, and so on. So it's something that plays a key role in many of these things. We know that also, as I said about, it's validated. Monoamines modulating therapies is a validated technology. There has been drug that has been marketed for many years using in the treatment of depression and pain within this aspect. However, a lot of these drugs have a lot of side effects because you can say monoamines are both dopamine, noradrenaline, and serotonin. So if you regulate one too much, you might get some benefits, like for example in depression, where you upregulate the serotonin levels, you reduce the depression, but by having too much depression, you also incur other side effects, sexual dysfunctions, for example. What we are developing in Initiator Pharma is compounds that are second generation. They have the same MOA, but they have a profile that differentiates them to what has been marketed already. And in this way, we could target indications more safely than before. Erectile dysfunction is, you can see, the main thesis of what we are talking about here. We see that more than 400 million men will suffer from erectile dysfunction in 2025. And we are focusing on the segment of patients that do not respond or cannot tolerate today's therapies out there. And I'll get into more details on that on the next slide. So as you observed in the beginning, I'm talking about organic and psychogenic erectile dysfunction. And you can say this is, of course, two very distinct groups of diseases. However, there is an overlap between these. So we often see that there's an overlap between the psychogenic and the organic. But if we choose to split it up, you can say the organic is more a physical impairment to deliver sufficient blood to the penile tissue. This is something that comes with age, overweight, lifestyle, and other cardiovascular complications. Whereas the psychogenic erectile dysfunction, as I mentioned before, is actually something that comes from depression, taking antidepressants, performance anxiety, low self-esteem, and indifference, and so on. So you can say overall, it's two very different indications. The phenotype is the same. You have erectile dysfunction, but the way to treat these also needs to be different. And that's why we are advancing two different drugs. And I will come back to that. So what do we do today with the erectile dysfunction patients? Well, they come to the doctor. They normally get what we call a PD-5 inhibitor, so Viagra, Cialis, and Levitra. And if it works, the follow-up visit, everything is good. Often we see that they do not respond that well. So then we try a higher dose. We try to change to another PD-5 inhibitor or combine them. But again, here it's really important to mention that the MOA, so the way they work, is exactly the same. The difference between these tablets is the duration of efficacy, where the Viagra is more short-lived and the Cialis is more long-lived. But you are strengthening the same response. And that's a peripheral response that I get to in a minute. So we actually know that about 30 to 35% of patients are unresponsive to this first line of treatment. And if we look for example, in diabetic patients, we see the non-responder rate increases to 50%. So what can we do here? Well, we try to treat the underlying disease they have in these cases, or get them to lose weight, or stop drinking or smoking as much. We have psychosexual therapy sessions, and then, as I mentioned, the lifestyle modifications. And then we also try to teach them how to use the PD-5s at the right time. But there's still a lot of patients that do not respond even after these things. And today, the only available treatments are injectables built on aprostadil, you can say, which is a direct injection into the penis, or inserting a small tablet inside the urine tract of the penis. And hereby you can induce an erection that's completely independent of stimulation. This is not very attractive for the men using this product, and we actually see a limited use of this, and people actually fall out of using of this simply because it's an erection that's independent of stimulation. So there is a significant unmet medical need here. So looking at what is actually happens and what is actually dopamine's role in the erection function. We're looking at here when the normal erection response is driven by you see something nice, you're being touched, you remember something, and all that is processed into the brain and results in a massive release of dopamine, particularly in the PVN, the paraventricular nucleus, which is what we can call the sixth center in the brain. Hereby it's transmitted down to the spinal cord, leads to the production of nitric oxide that causes a dilation of the blood arteries, increased blood flow to the penis, and hereby you get the erection. So you can say that what we are doing here is actually we are starting the erection from the brain, strengthening the natural erection response. We also see a peripheral effect of our compound. So if we do not have this, so in a mice model where we cut this connection, we can also see that the 2015 actually has an effect on the penile tissue itself. I mentioned before that the PD-5 compounds, Viagra, Cialis, are only peripheral acting compounds. So they do not have anything to do with what happens in the central nervous system. So they are only helping there to maintain this dilation of the blood arteries. So they do not induce any erection, but they can prolong a natural occurring erection. And that's a big differentiation. We can actually strengthen the natural erection response and thereby starting an erection in the men that do not respond to the PD-5 inhibitors. Looking at the more molecular level, what is it actually doing? There's pudafensine and IP2018. As I said, they are reuptake transport inhibitors. So upon the stimulation of the brain, we have this massive release of dopamine out of the neurons going into the synaptic cleft, where they bind to the postsynaptic receptors, thereby sending down the signal that we talked about before. The way that you can get ready for the next signaling is that these pumps, the transporters, are actually transporting the dopamine actively back into the neuron. And by inhibiting this transporter, we actually increase the concentration of dopamine in the cleft, but also the duration is there, and thereby getting a much stronger signal. And thereby you can say we are strengthening the natural erection response. And this is true for both compounds, both pudafensine and IP2018. The differentiating factor between these two compounds is that pudafensine, which is used for organic, is primarily driven by dopamine, whereas IP2018 also has a very large serotonin effect. So you can say the profile is different. And that's because, remember, in these patients that we're treating with 2018, we are talking about mild depressed, low mood patients where we also need to boost the serotonin levels. And that's the difference between the two compounds and the indications that they're targeting. So what we have ongoing in the clinical trials, as I said, the IP2018 and the psychogenic ED was a phase 2A study of 24 patients. We completed that with positive data. And right now we're doing the post-hoc analysis of the data, and we're also getting the final report. And based on this, we would actually decide how we actually can advance this best possible. And that means what is the right clinical trial to do in phase 2B. But in parallel to that, of course, we're doing a lot of business development, talking to the interested parties that have been following this study for some time and trying to bring up to them saying, this is based on the results, we suggest doing this, and seeing if we can find a way to collaborate or even another way that they take over the program entirely. So that's something we are looking at right now, and we look forward to be able to update you on this as we progress. The other trial, the IPET 2015, is an organic erectile dysfunction with the podafensin drug. Here it's a phase 2b, is an intercourse study. I'll come back to that, 120 patients. We have completed all the enrollment, and we are now expecting top-line data coming out in Q4 this year. So we are on the trajectory actually to change the treatment paradigm for many, many men suffering from erectile dysfunction. The 2018 program, psychogenic, I'm just briefly going to tell what we did. Here we included patients it's a 3-way crossover at 2 dose levels. It is a proper randomized double-blinded placebo-controlled study. So every patient that comes into the clinic comes in 3 times. Once received placebo, high dose and low dose of IP 2018. What we are looking at, since this is a phase 2 trial, of course, is safety and tolerability. And then we use the Regiscan apparatus assessment to measure what is actually happening when we take this. The patients, as I said, we include here are mild depressed with low mood. And you see the Hamilton Depression Scale between 7 to 23 and an EIF score of 12 to 18. Then we bring them into the clinic and we show them an erotic movie and we measure with the Regiscan apparatus what is happening. And here, actually, we saw really nice results coming out of this. We are very positive, and we think these results are very strong because they are actually demonstrating that the clinical relevant efficacy endpoints that is so important for completing an intercourse is actually exactly what we see is coming out here with p-values, so we get statistical significance. The high dose of IP 2018 showed an increased penile tumescence. The high dose of IP 2018 showed increased duration of rigidity. And we see a dose-dependent significant efficacy of 2018. We see no observations of concern. So the observations we see are what we normally see in clinical trials, a little bit of headache and gastrointestinal, but they are very mild. And we don't see anything here that is making us believing that we do not have a safe and tolerable drug. Looking at the other program, the IPET 2015, in organic erectile dysfunction, we are looking here again. We did a similar study back in the day in a phase 2A study where we had 12 patients in. And again, here we could actually see that we had a good response rate with the Regiscan apparatus. So the next step in this clinical trial was actually going in and saying, okay, how do we do this even better? What is the next thing that we want to show? And here we are doing a phase 2B trial. This is a 3-arm trial. It's 120 patients, so there's no crossover here. We have 3 groups. 1 cohort is on placebo, 1 cohort is on low dose podafensin, and 1 dose is on high group. But it is a proper placebo-controlled and double-blinded study. We have been conducted at 7 sites in the UK. What's really interesting is the endpoints that we are chosen here. Is actually we use the EIF score. And this is exactly the same score that both Viagra and Cialis has been approved for back in the day when they registered the compounds. So again, this is not a study where we showed in a movie. This is actually a study where you go home and you have an intercourse with your partner. And based on after that intercourse, there's a follow-up visit where you fill out a questionnaire, which is the EIF domain score. And here you were talking about not only about the physical capabilities of getting an erection, but you also talk very much about sexual desire, orgasmic function, overall intercourse satisfaction, and so on. The design is what we call a repeat dosing study. So you actually come into the clinic 6 times in total. 4 of the times you're there, you receive dosing, and then you go home and you have, or you can have an intercourse with your partner. So you can say in this way we have a system where you can say we actually have multiple points of reading out, do we have efficacy? And this is a really strong study, and we look forward to see the results of this. In parallel to the assessment we have done, we also have looked at semen assessment, and we also have done some Regiscan here to bridge to the previously phase 2A study. And then, of course, we do a lot of PK/PD in some of the subgroups, trying to understand what is the drug doing, because we still need to understand what is the best way to take this into a phase 3 trial. But we're looking very much forward to see the results of this. And I'm highly encouraged by, not only looking at erection, but also looking at orgasmic function, intercourse satisfaction, and so on as really a significant readout of this trial. But looking forward to see the results in Q4. So Initiator Pharma, our unique offering to investors. Why should you invest in us? I hope I convinced you that we have an attractive risk-reward profile of our programs. And that, of course, you can say they are mid-stage, so we are actually generating really significant efficacy data. Also, we are and safety data as well. That the targets that we are targeting are validated. We know that it's a clinical proof of concept, so there's a direct link between the targets we have and the MOA that we are trying to pursue. The targets represent significant unmet medical needs, where there's a lot of patients and there is commercial attractive positioning, which I've seen before by, for example, the blockbuster sales of Viagra and Cialis back in the day. The clinical trials that we are running require only modest investment, and you can see the inflection points are coming fairly swift compared to a lot of other indications. What we see here is that the endpoints of the trials are validated endpoints, so that's something that's been done before, so we are not inventing something new here, so we know exactly what we need to measure, and we look forward to get an approval. And that's also why we included these endpoints in the phase 2b, to make sure we can actually demonstrate that we will reach this in this study. So we have delivered proof of concept clinical data already for 2018 and 2015 in the phase 2As. And now we're looking forward to deliver the phase 2B data with the 120 patients here in Q4 of this year. We are, as I mentioned, we are a very cost-efficient organization, so we have a very low burn. The money we spent, we actually put into our clinical trials because that's where we generate value. And as I said, we have financing secured well beyond 2014, so that means into 2025. So we're in a good position compared to a lot of other companies in this area. But also, we are actually reaching a number of significant inflection points, giving us the opportunity to pursue the BD effort that we have been working on for many, many years, persuading the farmers to see that there is a unique opportunity here for getting drugs for patients in need. Last but not least, as I mentioned, management has a significant shareholdings, and we are serial entrepreneurs with a solid track record in developing drugs. And everything we do, we can also see a benefit for all our retail investors, all our institutional investors, and also ourselves. So we are really committed to this, and we look forward to presenting the data when we get it. And with that, I would like to say thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Klaus, for the presentation. And I would like to start off with some questions then. Maybe you could just describe a little bit the differences between IP2018 and pudafensine, as you are. Sure.
So we can say that we're looking at pudafensine. Pudafensine is a drug where we see the most effect on dopamine. So you can say that the primary driving of the efficacy we see in the organic erectile dysfunction trials is by increasing the dopamine levels. 2018 is different. Here we actually see quite a significant effect on serotonin, and then you can see equal or a little bit less, we also see the dopamine. So you can say, compared to other drugs that merely, for example, for depression, where it was just serotonin that was the key importance, and you actually ended up in a scenario where you got, sexual dysfunctions. Now we have so much dopamine present that we are, strengthening the natural erection response, so it's not getting, you can say, contaminated by the increased serotonin levels. So that's the difference in the two compounds. Yeah.
Perfect. And you have studied both now in 2A studies and have some patients on the drugs. How comparable is or similar are the safety profiles of the drugs? Do you see the same types of adverse events?
Yeah, so it's the same kind of events we see. It's really important when we're running trials with monoamines in general. We know that when you increase the dosing too much, nausea is one of the first things picks up. Mm-hmm. And so that is the thing that, of course, we follow very much. Nausea is one thing. We also see sometimes nausea in the placebo groups. And that's because, it's the phase 2As we have been conducting. You can say you are in the clinic and you are surrounded by male nurses. You go into a dark room, you watch these movies. So it is somewhat an artificial setting. And for some people, that at some point just get a little bit too much. So sometimes when you ask repeatedly about, are you feeling okay, you get a little bit this. But that's also why we see it in the placebo group. But there's no difference in that. So you can say from the safety profile, they look very much the same.
Okay, sounds good. And you also mentioned, great. Yeah, my question was about your monoamine modulators, second generation. What's the difference compared to the first generation?
Yeah, so you can say the first generation of compounds were, as I said, were very much focused on just one thing. For example, the antidepressant has always been focused on getting a serotonin level that will, give them efficacy for depression, give them antidepressive effects. However, we know that this the sexual function is very much dependent on not having too high levels of serotonin. We actually know, looking at people taking antidepressants, so across the board of many different compounds, about 68 or even higher % of the patients taking antidepressants have sexual dysfunctions. Yeah. So that's quite a significant number. So you can say what we actually, with the compounds we're advancing, you can say we are having a more unique or more appropriate profile of serotonin and dopamine. And of course, when you have to profile three different things, both the serotonin, the dopamine, and noradrenaline, there's many opportunities. And what we have found with pudafensine is just very unique, because you say from the same family of compounds, you only see this compound have an effect in our ED models. So compounds that are very similar, but just change a little bit in profile, do not have the same effect. So that's quite unique, and that's also why we think that this is not something that is really easy to copycat for others, because it is quite unique properties of pudafensine that we are working with here, and also in the case of 2018.
Okay. Sounds good. And I want to stay on the sort of a historical track here, and I mean, raising the dopamine levels in and trying to treat sexual dysfunction has been on the table for some time, and I guess Abbott got the drug approved in Europe at least. And could you also perhaps describe why that wasn't a success? And yeah.
Thank you very much for raising that question, Claes, because it is one thing that you can say when we talked about we wanting to work with something that's validated. So it actually has been validated that dopamine plays a really important role in the erection response. We know that even from increasing dopamine in Parkinson's patients, we sometimes see an increased erection response here. There's other molecules on the market that has tried to increase the dopamine levels and thereby looking for efficacy. However, they all have one thing in common, is that they are not very tolerable. So there's, when you start dosing them, you start seeing side effects. You start seeing a lot of nausea because you target too many other things. And you can say what some of the reasons for that. Instead of working with these reuptake inhibitors that we're working with, they're working with agonists of the receptors in the brain. So when you actually administrate these, you can say you kind of flush the whole system to activate by binding to the receptors. With an reuptake inhibitor, you can say you get the most effect in the parts of the brain where there is a release of dopamine. And in this case, when you're being stimulated, it's in the PVN, so the sex center of the brain. And thereby you can say the compound will have its largest effect where there's a lot of reuptake of dopamine into the neurons. So this is one of the reasons we see a better safety profile. But it is, again, it's nice to see that dopamine is validated. So it is a validated target for strengthening the response. We are just the first ones that has a drug that has made it this far with the safety profile that we have.
Perfect. And staying on the sort of the development pathway, then, I mean, you mentioned the PDE5s that on the market, and you have other alternatives that not perhaps that attractive to patients with ED. But do you see any other activity that you are seeing that is promising, that is under development right now?
There is if you look at the market, you would say that 99% of the things that we see going on out there is reformulations of the PD5, so trying to make it faster and trying to make it a more on-demand use and so on. So again, since we are targeting the non-responders or the people who cannot tolerate these, we do not see them as competitors. And we also see this is an MOA that has been explored for quite some time. Some patients it work, and for a lot of patients this does not. Then there's a few companies that are trying to advance the different modalities out there. And there's also a company in Sweden that are trying to advance something and going in and starting recruiting patients in. And that's really exciting programs where you're actually trying to advance different MOAs. What we see in general is that they're trying to target a little bit more the mild ED patients. So not the ones we are looking at. We are looking at the moderate to the severe patients in our studies, because we think that's where the biggest need is. So that's what we're going forward. Then there's also been a few devices registered, gels and so on, but with no active pharmaceutical ingredient. And again, that has primarily been targeted towards the very mild ED patients. So of course there is things moving around, but it's also nice to see that suddenly people have realized there is a need here that we need to do something about, because we have been the only ones coming up with a new, you can say, MOA for a number of years and been working on this. So it's nice to see some of other pharma companies are starting to move on this as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed. And so you are now approaching a very important time in your lifetime for the company, at least. I mean, could you just describe why you believe the 2A studies, are probably both, are so important, and why you believe they are translatable into that we could expect a positive outcome in the 2B as well?
I can do that, Claes, but maybe I'll say one thing first. This is, of course, the biggest trial we have done in 120 patients. But I just want to emphasize that we have actually shown now in 2 clinical trials, in a phase 2A for 2018 and in a phase 2A for pudafensine, that actually we have efficacy. We also are a safe drug. So you can say that, of course, this is the vital point for pudafensine in erectile dysfunction. But remember, on pudafensine, we have also shown really strong data in the pain challenge study. So you can say, of course, this is a key value inflection point for the company, but it's not. We are not a one pony trick here. We actually got multiple things on our very diverse pipeline, and I also think that we have drugs where we understand the MOA and they are safe. But we are looking forward, of course, to demonstrate that this also works in the phase 2B study for ED. The reason why I believe that we will see good data coming out of the phase 2B trial is that we are looking at, you can say, now we look at an intercourse. We are looking at a more natural setting. So as I said, in the phase 2As, the men that are being treated are in the clinic. They are surrounded by male nurses. They are going into the dark rooms and watching erotic movies. That's maybe not their preference of choice. So there's a lot of places where you can cause more anxiety. And as we've shown on psychogenic ED, anxiety is not good for the erection response. So in the phase 2B, we do this intercourse where you get the tablet and then you go home and you have a normal intercourse. So you're being stimulated not only by a movie, but you're actually being stimulated by your partner that you like being with. You're also in the home setting, so there's nobody observing you. You don't feel that somebody's looking at a computer screen and saying, now we have something happening here. So this is actually you're in completely safe environment by being at home. In addition to that, we know that dopamine plays a really important role, not only in the erection response, but also in this sensitization. Was it a good intercourse? How was the satisfaction? Did you reach the orgasmic climax and so on? And here we know that dopamine is a really important contributor to this. Remember, dopamine is a compound that tells you something nice is going to happen. And when you strengthen all these on top of getting the physical capabilities, then the outcome should be better. So we're looking very much forward to see this data. And that's the beautiful thing of having these many questions in the assessment questionnaire, is that we can look at how are people responding to the different questions here. And do we see a difference between the repeat dosings and so on? So we have multiple things in this study we can read out. And therefore, we're looking very much forward to see the results when they get here.
And a short last question. How have you been able to have a low to sort of have a good compliance rate for the patient that has been included in the study?
So you can say compliance is the best way to make sure that you have good compliance with patients is by selecting the right patients that are enrolled in the study. And you can say that for the 2018 study, we saw that took quite a bit of time to complete that. Mm-hmm. We had issues or challenges getting enough patients in. But it was because we always wanted to make sure we didn't have too many dropouts. Because that, first of all, it loses the power of the study, it costs more money, and ultimately it takes more time since we cannot use the data if they're only being dosed once. So you can say that we are really strict with who we include in the trials. And you can say, of course, we have learned a lot from all the interviews that's been conducted throughout the recruitment of patients. And of course, that's something we are assessing as well, trying to understand, why did they not take them in? Was that due to medical conditions, or was it due to, maybe we felt that they wouldn't show up enough simply from some of the answers? So that's a way to make sure you get a good trial, is making you have strict inclusion criteria. But of course, there's still no guarantee. So, but you need to be very diligent in what you do, and that's what we have in MAC. We have a really good CRO that is really diligent on these interviews and do a lot of time to assess as well what the feedback they get.
Sounds very good. Thank you so much, Klaus, for the presentation and the Q&A session, and apologizing for some technical issues from our side. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and no problem. Have a great day.
Thank you.